Hi, my name is Sarah, and I would like to share with you a little bit about Nourish Eco Village, how and why it got started, and the important work that we are doing in growing resilience in wildlife communities in Southern Africa. So let's jump right in. As mentioned, my name is Sarah, and I'm the founder of Nourish. I started Nourish in 2011 to really address a need that I saw. It was a really personal journey for me, and Nourish is really the result of so many things that I saw. And I would like to share that with you in a few stumbling words, but to really take you on that journey with me. So, in order to do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of context. South Africa is a phenomenal country, but one that really is struck by harsh contrasts. We have the beautiful Timbavati Private Nature Reserve and the myriad of other private nature reserves where people can come from all over the world to experience nature and the natural heritage that South Africa is so proud to offer. I was privileged enough to grow up in this landscape. I grew up at one of the game reserves in the heart of the Timbavati. I was homeschooled and I was raised with elephants and lions literally in my backyard. But what that did was gave me the incredible privilege to see that not everybody gets to experience this. Not everybody in South Africa has an equal opportunity. It also showed me a few other things. It showed me that not all the money coming into tourism is making its way across the boundaries of the tourism landscape into the rural communities. It showed me that a lot of conservation and the tourism that comes with it lies in the hands of a certain demographic of society. It showed me that if you had enough money, you could pay to experience rhino, elephant, lion, a beautiful sunset in the middle of the wilderness. And if you didn't have money, that was fenced off from you. I got to experience that if you were born into the wrong household and part of the post-apartheid legacy, that really there was no access, and more than that, there was no benefit to this beautiful conservation landscape that I could call home. And growing up in all of this, I started to ask questions. I started to wonder why. I wondered why communities weren't more integrated into the conservation process. I wondered why tourists couldn't experience the culture that sat on the doorstep of their wildlife experience. I started to wonder why there were issues in poverty and poaching and how I could play a role. And to be honest, the answer was that I didn't know. So what I did was what anybody did. I spent a few years trying to figure it out. I got my degree in humanities and really explored education and development. And then in 2011, started Nourish with the goal of connecting communities to conservation and really trying to work in the space between those two areas with people and wildlife and with the problems that were inherent in those. The problems of poverty, which was a root cause of so many social ills, and the problems of wildlife crime that was happening in the reserves. These two problems, which in my mind did not sit side by side, but sat interlinked. And that is where I wanted to play a role. And when I looked around over 10 years ago now, I did not find an NGO that I could work for that connected those two landscapes. And that's where and why Nourish was really born. To nourish a connection to each other across social and racial boundaries, to nourish a connection to the environment, to nourish a connection between people and planet, between conservation and communities. And that's where Nourish was birthed. So now that you know why we got started and who I am in the picture, the crazy visionary who just wanted to make a difference, let me chat to you about what Nourish really managed to get kickstarted all those years ago. So initially, Nourish was focused on really trying to find ways to connect communities and conservation. And the initial start of this was to go and chat to the chief of the local village. This is very different than in many countries because in South Africa, much of the land is owned under traditional rule. So chiefs and what we call indunas, a headman of the village, will own the land. And for me, it was fundamental to go and sit and understand what these communities' needs were and how I could go about serving these needs. A year of beneficiation processes and a year of communication processes led to really understanding the grassroots needs of the community that sat just one road away from the wildlife landscape. Elephants on the left-hand side, children walking barefoot to school on the right-hand side. 5-star lodges on the left-hand side, people walking with wheelbarrows to fetch water on the right-hand side. So for me, this was the perfect village and community in which I wanted to start, and the chief was keen. So the first thing that happened was, after a year of negotiating, Nourish got a piece of community-owned land with the goal of starting a craft centre to enable the local community to sell wares directly to tourism and thereby benefit from the tourism traffic in the area, but also a library, with the goal being that children could learn how to speak good enough English to access jobs. So my starting point was simple: helping people to access benefit from conservation-based tourism. And that's where it all started, with trying to enable people to really get benefit from the beautiful natural heritage that was on their doorstep. I remember a few things fondly from this whole process. One, that it takes a long time to start a real community development program. And in a way, this is a refining process, because not everybody would stick it out. Not everybody would engage with a community for a year to try to get some headway. But I was really passionate about it. I really wanted to. I really believed in it. And it happened. And I was glad. It was almost a refining process, a purging process. So I knew what it was that I wanted to do. It also enabled me to have one of my most special memories, sitting under a huge marula tree deep in one of the villages, with the chief discussing with the elders whether or not he would give me this piece of the land that belonged to his people. I didn't understand much of what was being said, but I could see that there was dialogue. I could see that some people were not keen for community-owned land to be in the hands of this stranger. And I could see that other people were keen for a library and craft centre, for jobs, for benefit. But I do remember the final words. The chief stood up and said, in the words of Nelson Mandela, "Black and white shall live together." And in that moment, I knew that we had the chief's blessing and that everything was going to go ahead. The whole process also showed me that even though I had this idea in mind for starting Nourish, that I had to be willing to go back to the drawing board time and time again in order to remain authentic to responding to the community needs. So my idea of a craft centre and library was the first thing I had on my page, but that was not the first real need. The first thing that Nourish did eventually start and build was a food garden. Engaging with the local primary school gave me a chance to really understand how many children came from vulnerable and broken homes, and how many of their carers, mothers, grandmothers would be willing to work hard in a food garden just to take home the fruits of their labor. But they didn't even have that. They didn't even have the access to a secure piece of farming land where no goats would eat their food. They didn't have access to the seedlings, the mulch, the compost, the water, the tools. These little things that were needed in order to gain food security were something that they did not have. So that is how Nourish was started, literally with a food garden, nourishing food security. All that happened is that I created a platform, and children's parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, mainly women, came to work in the garden and took home everything that grew. And that was how Nourish was born, in our permaculture food security garden. Thereafter, we added a borehole so that we would have a permanent source of water. Thereafter, we got funding for a beautiful rammed earth library to be developed, where children could come after school for help with homework, reading, English literacy, and then to learn so much more. Slowly, Nourish Eco Village was developing into a space where children could come, where adults could come, where community members could feel welcome, and where they could walk away with something that would benefit them, feeling nourished, having grown. And all the time, for me, one of the key aspects was remembering that I wanted to be an inspiration for the community, to show that living lightly on the planet is possible. Living better on the earth is possible. And this was done not through force feeding, but rather through incorporating permaculture principles, water-wise agriculture principles, showing how to build with sand, and recycling in the library, making ceilings out of thatch grass instead of artificial materials. For me, the Nourish Eco Village was a space to inspire, to dream, and to live all those aspects, instead of a case of trying to preach. You can imagine how wonderful it felt to see my dream become a reality and the Nourish Eco Village become a very real space where change was happening on a daily basis. But the good thing about the Nourish Eco Village model was that it was really developed to respond to the community needs, which meant that I did not want to be one thing to everybody, but rather everything to somebody. I took the theory that in order for change to be successful, we don't only need one thing. A human cannot survive with only one thing. I cannot survive if I could only spend my salary on one thing. Therefore, in order for us to change the way that communities lived, in order for us to really impact poverty, in order for us to really impact conservation and wildlife crime, we needed to get to the root. And we needed to do so in a holistic manner, which is the only way that we could really change how people make decisions, how people live, are educated, connect with each other, and grow. And so the holistic model underpinned every decision, and it guided the addition of new projects time and again. We saw that children had no access to the park, to the wildlife landscape, to nature. And this happened through a really special story. We went to one of the local primary schools, and children were having to draw a photo of a rhino in order to win a prize. It was a sweet little initiative. And one little girl sat there, and she erased her paper, and she erased her paper, and eventually she started crying. And I asked a translator what was happening, and he said that she was being teased because she didn't know what a rhino looked like, so she kept drawing a cow, and her friends were teasing her. This showed me how important it was for us to keep ourselves really true, for us to keep ethical, for us to keep bringing ourselves back to that place of humility, to understanding not what we think people need, but what they really need. That launched the chance for us to get engaged in environmental education and really immersive experiences for these children that grew up across the road from some of the most beautiful wildlife landscapes in the world. Green Kids was a chance for us to take children into the Kruger National Park, to take them on game drive, to show them their very first elephant, to let that little girl see a rhino. This was a chance for us to really educate children in these communities on the beautiful natural heritage that they could call their own. Green Kids was the very next project that was added. And then linked to that came the fact that children were dropping out of school for several reasons. One of them was not having school uniforms. Children in South Africa require school uniforms in order to go to school. So we launched a school uniform project to keep children in school. Girls were dropping out of school when they would menstruate because sanitary pads and sanitary wear was too expensive. So we launched our own sewing project in order to sew reusable sanitary pads for young girls. Children that were coming to us after school were struggling with a lack of energy. And I didn't understand why. Why were they struggling and not wanting to play soccer, not wanting to learn about nature, not wanting to do their homework? And we realized that for many children, the one meal a day in the government feeding scheme at school was the only meal that they got. So the children were simply hungry. And these kind of realities made us realize that we needed to look at the pyramid of human need. We needed to understand that humans have a real need for their base needs to be covered before we can educate and before we can self-actualize. So we started a feeding program, which up to today is feeding 120 children on a daily basis. So this is the way that our holistic approach kept having to adapt and respond to community needs with Green Kids, with sanitary pads, with school uniforms, with the food program. We started a crafting program, which is what we discussed with the chief, with the women being able to do traditional beading, weaving, and making crafts out of recycling. Linked to this came the need for our own preschool, as mothers came to try to craft to earn an income, but would have a little child because they couldn't afford to send it to the preschool in the village. So we created a non-fee paying creche so that mothers could put their child there in a safe environment, knowing that they would be supported, cared for, fed, nurtured, and that the mother could then focus on earning a livelihood for her family. Year after year, for the last 10 years, we've responded to the different needs. And the parts that were not needed, where perhaps ego led my way, fell away, because Nourish never had the ability to keep something going that didn't really fill a need, that was unwanted. And so the most beautiful evolution has happened over the last 10 years. This might sound a little confusing, and until you visit the Nourish Eco Village space, perhaps it could be. In order to simplify, we shaped all our interventions around 5 pillars: conservation, education, agriculture, enterprise, and tourism. This has since become streamlined into education, enterprise, and tourism. Now that you've learned a little bit about our journey and who and what we are and why we do what we do, let's chat through some of the more formal structured Nourish interventions and understand where Nourish NPO is currently at. Our why, our how, and our what. Why? Why does Nourish exist? To create sustainable development and solutions in wildlife buffer zones that protect the natural environment. How do we do that? We do that by growing resilient wildlife communities through engagement in conservation and sustainability. What do we do? Programming designed around education, enterprise, and tourism, which is delivered through an eco-village model. Our foundational pillars of programming and our ethos are resilience, conservation, and sustainability. Underpinning our sustainability goals are not only financial sustainability, but also the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. We use these goals to bring impact through all our programming. We use unison amongst all 3 concepts of sustainability, resilience, and conservation to be our benchmark. Our education programs fall into different age categories. Our young ones, our little babies, go into our RISE program, which is from the age of 6 months to about 5 years. The RISE program is focused on experiential learning, play-based learning, and structured, positive, fun early childhood development. Our Green Kids program is an immersive, hands-on way for children to learn about their natural environment through activities and programs and projects on a daily basis. Our Green Kids Club after school includes other social development such as arts, crafts, music, yoga, homework, and English reading. Our Green Leaders program is one of our new programs that we've added to our portfolio, which is focused on teens and is focused on positive growth for girls and boys to be young leaders in their own realm. Our enterprise programs through Sadiwa are focused on training and skills development, as well as incubating small businesses to assist them in developing their full potential. After people have come through training and incubation, they're welcome to enter our enterprise hub, where their small businesses and our small business franchises live. Sewing projects, wild spa projects, culinary agro-processing projects, and hospitality are just some of the opportunities that local community members can access when they come through our Sadiwa enterprise pillar. And last but not least, tourism. Enabling sustainable enterprise development through sustainable and regenerative tourism. Responsible tourism is key in our communities and ensuring that communities get real benefit from the tourism footprint in the area. With so much foot traffic and so many international tourists trafficking this area, it would be crazy to not engage in ethical, responsible tourism. Working alongside foundations and community organizations such as Fair Trade Tourism ensure that our program is built in the right manner. Our Chic Shack backpackers accommodation, community tours, and expeditions allow people to engage in cultural tourism in a way that is fun, safe, and respectful. The Nourish internships and educational tourism are a way for people to come and experience life in an eco-village and to get hands-on in the Nourish projects in a way that will benefit their school career or at the very least broaden their horizons. For people who don't have a master's or a PhD or a university degree to pursue, we also offer experiential tourism, where for several weeks people can come and be engaged in real, authentic, grassroots work. Experiential opportunities in our Green Kids program, our RISE ECD program, and cultural language immersion are available. All of our tourism program offerings also form part of our sustainability journey. What does the future hold? Well, with a systems thinking approach and a sustainable development goal lens, our goal into the future is to replicate Nourish eco-villages into buffer zones across Southern Africa. We want to roll out more eco-villages into areas where we see the same developmental challenges and into areas where we can play a positive role linking communities to conservation in a meaningful way. Through developing more Nourish eco-villages alongside wildlife spaces and in areas where there's community and conservation conflict, our educational pathway, our enterprise, and our tourism can bring about long-term sustainable and regenerative change. So watch this space for more eco-villages as we unfold over Southern Africa. You've now gotten the background, the structure, and the way forward. Our replicable Nourish eco-village model. Thank you for joining us on this learning process, and we hope that you've enjoyed learning about the Nourish eco-village.